I'm sure that many of you have heard of test-first development. It's one of the key concepts of certainly the extreme programming form of Agile development. And it has a number of strengths, but it's also got some limitations. And as so often happens with practices that people get very enraptured with, they may not necessarily recognize the limitations, and when they don't recognize the limitations, that puts them at risk in two ways. First of all, because the limitations are occurring, and second, because they're not likely to be able to deal with them. And then I want to introduce you to the methodology that I advocate and developed called proactive testing. And I would contend that proactive testing is truly agile, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's not something that most people in the Agile and test-first development community are aware of. And the proactive testing offers a number of advantages that enable you to develop software quicker, cheaper, and better. So whereas most testing I would suggest is often viewed as an obstacle to progress, proactive testing actually helps the developers get their work done quicker, cheaper, and better. And then I want to give you some examples of proactive testing and how it, among other things, reveals numerous otherwise overlooked test conditions that when they are overlooked, testers obviously don't have any way to deal with them, and they're often overlooked because the developers overlook them as well. So they are conditions that need to be tested that are more likely to result in problems. And then proactive testing is very much of a risk-based methodology. And by identifying overlooked conditions, then you have the choice of whether or not or how much to address them. So you selectively address them based upon risk. I would suggest that traditional testing tends to be reactive. And although I work extensively in the testing community, the fact is that the testers that I work with, the organizations that do testing, many of them realize that their testing is not as effective as they'd like it to be. They probably also are concerned about the efficiency of it, and I fear that in many instances their awareness is only the tip of the iceberg. Traditional testing too often tends to get involved at the end when the defects have already been created and when the number of defects is maximum, and therefore the difficulty of detecting all of them is maximal, and when they are found late in the process, they're also the most expensive to fix. And in fact, one of the most common experiences that testers get frustrated by is that they find defects and the developers don't have the time to fix them. Another thing that we tend in our development processes that people tend not to be aware of is that developers make a lot more errors than they realize. And they generally find and fix far fewer of the total errors than they believe. They pretty much are convinced that they've found all the errors and fixed all of them when the code gets handed over for testing and implementation, when in fact testers and users know that there are still plenty of errors usually left in that code. And the other issue that makes testing less efficient and less effective than it could be is that very often, by the time that the testers get involved, they don't have sufficient knowledge or sufficient time to test as thoroughly as they need to. They are aware of this to some extent. Frankly, most testers aren't aware of the extent to which they lack knowledge and certainly the time. Now, Agile development, which on the development side is probably best known through extreme programming, which has been around for around 8 or 9 years. Was described in a series of books by Kent Beck and other people. Includes several important test-driven techniques. One of those is pair programming. That is, in the Agile development team, there are really only 3 members, fundamental members of an Agile team. 2 developers and a user representative or customer representative. And the 2 developers work together to program. And when they do that, one will do some programming and the other will review it, and vice versa. And this is a technique which has been known for a number of years. It's referred to informally as buddy checking. And it's a very efficient and low overhead technique for catching errors before they become bigger errors. It's easy to have your buddy, your partner, check your code, and they will spot things that maybe you missed. So pair programming, a form of repeated reviews of the code as it's being developed, is a very effective and proven technique for catching problems before they become bigger problems. The second technique is called test-first development. And this is a method which some people perhaps used prior to extreme programming becoming well known, but frankly it's a technique which is most closely associated with extreme programming. And the concept is that before the developer writes the program code, the developer first creates essentially unit tests. And then they write the program code and execute those unit tests. And when the unit tests are all passed, that's the basis for saying that the program is working acceptably. The other benefit of the test-first development is because the tests are automated, whenever the code is changed or added to, the tests are also changed or added to and then rerun. And so as the development of the particular piece of code proceeds, each time there's a revision, the developer reruns all of the accumulated tests that have been written. And consequently, extreme programming tends to result in a lot more testing, certainly unit testing, than traditional development sometimes has.